Hello friends, today I will discuss about function of DC selector switch for selection of double DC source. So here in this figure you can see double DC source has been given to the CRP panel, and here you can see that is DC double S, that is a DC selector switch. So this selector switch can select either source 1 or source 2 or independent. So this is the DC selector switch, and these are the position of the DC selector switch. So in this video I'll discuss why double DC source is important and how the DC selector switch select the source 1 by means of the source 1 selection, and independent by means of the independent position, and source 2 by means of the source 2 positions. So what is the purpose of DC in a substation? So number one is auxiliary supply for the all protective relay. For feeder, it is main protection is distance protection, and for transformer main protection is REF and differential protection. Apart from that, there exists overcurrent and earthfall protection, LBB protection, busbar protection, etc. So all these numerical relays are supplied by means of the auxiliary DC. Number two, auxiliary supply to the closing and tripping coil of the circuit breaker. The circuit breaker is the equipment which clear the fault and isolate from the healthy system. So, for auxiliary supply of the closing and tripping coil, the DC supply is given to the circuit breaker. Number three is the auxiliary supply for the indication control circuit, for the isolator and metering circuit, and DC emergency lighting. So why double DC source is used in a substation? So double DC source is used in a substation for redundancy purpose. For example, in case of circuit breaker, there exists two trip coil, and each trip coil is supplied from that separate DC source. There is the failure of the either of the trip coil or either of the DC source will not impact the operation of the circuit breaker under fault condition. Again, in CRP panel, main 1 and main 2 relay is used for feeder and transformer. For feeder, main 1 and main 2 distance protection relay is used for voltage level 132 kV and above voltage system. And this main 1 and main 2 relay is supplied by means of separate DC source. That is, either failure of the one relay or one DC source will not impact the uh, operation of the relay under fault condition. So here the schematic has been shown for the DC selector switch and double DC source. So here J11 and J12 is the DC source 1, and J21 and 22 is the DC source 2. Since two separate DC sources used in a CRP panel, there exist two DC supervision relay, that is 80 DC1 and 80 DC2. 80 DC1 monitor the DC healthiness of the DC of DC source 1, and 80 DC2 monitor the healthiness of the DC source 1. So here the push button is given that if this push button is pressed, then in the panel this annunciator uh, give a alarm, and that is the failure of DC source 1. Okay. Again, if this push button is pressed in the CRP panel, a annunciator alarm will be given, that is the failure of the DC source 2. So you can see that the main one for feeder protection, main one distance protection, and trip coil 1 of the circuit breaker is supplied with the DC source 1, that is the before the DC selector switch, and main 2 distance protection and DC2 of the circuit breaker is supplied with the DC source 2, that is the before the DC selection switch. So in case of feeder, the main 1 and main 2 protection is the distance protection. In case of the transformer, the main 1 and main 2 protection is differential protection and REF protection. Okay, so this is the DC selector switch. So in this DC selector switch, there are three positions. One is source 1, independent, and source 2. Okay, so you can see that Before the DC selection, source 1 is given to the trip coil of the circuit breaker and to the main one distance protection. And before the DC selection, the source 2 is given to the supply of the trip circuit of the circuit breaker uh, and main to distance protection circuit. So in case of failure of one DC, for example, that is a failure of the DC source 1. So in this scenario, the main one distance protection remain inoperative and TC1 remain inoperative. So during fault condition, the main to distance protection will sense this fault and send a trip signal to the circuit breaker. Since source 1 is failure of the source 1, the trip coil 2 will be energized under this condition and it will send a trip signal to the circuit breaker to isolate the faulty system from the system. So in the DC selector switch, there exists three positions: source 1, independent and source 2. So this is the after the DC selector switch position, that is J15, J16, J25 and J26. So whenever the switch position is kept at source 1, then 1P1, 1P2, 2P1, 2P2, 5P1, 5P2 and 5P3 and 5P4 contact will be activated. So J15 and J16 will get DC from the DC source 1 via this 5P1, 5P2 and 5P3, 5P4 contact. Again, J25 and J26 will get DC from the DC source 1. So here the path will be from 1P1, 1P2 and 2P1 and 2P2 contact. So in this case, uh, J15 and J16 and J25 and J26, that is both will be dependent on DC source 1. Now whenever the DC selector switch kept at independent position, then this path will be activated. Okay, that is 4P1, 4P2, 4P3 and 4P4 and 5P1 and 5P2, 5P3 and 5P4. So in this case, J15 and J16 will get DC from the DC source 1. Okay, via 5P1, 5P2, 5P3 and 5P4 contact. And J25 and J26 will get DC from this contact. Okay, from 4P1 and 4P2, 4P3 and 4P4 contact. So you can see that is after the selection, if the DC selector position, switch position is kept at independent, then J15 and J16 will get DC from the DC source 1 and J25 and J26 will get DC from the DC source 2. That is the DC selection in this case, after the DC selector, it is independent of the switch position. So here J15 and J16 will get DC from the DC source 1 and J25 and J26 will get DC from the DC source 2. That is why it is the independent position. Again, if the switch position is kept at source 2, in this case, the uh, contact which will be activated as 2P3, 2P4 and 3P3 and 3P4. Again 4P1, 4P2 and 4P3 and 4P4 will be activated. So in this case, J15 and J16 will get DC from 2P3 and 2P4 contact and 3P3 and 3P4 contact via DC source 2. Again, J25 and J26 will get DC from the contact 4P1 and 4P2, 4P3 and 4P4 from the DC source 2. So in this case, both J15, J16 and J25 and J26 will be selected from the DC source 2 since the switch position is kept at source 2. So here the schematic has been shown for the DC selector switch and after the DC selector switch position. So J15, J16 is after the DC selector switch position and J25 and J26 after the DC selector switch position. So you can see that is J15, J16 is used for the isolator control circuit, sync circuit, metering circuit, that is the auxiliary supply to all the meters, voltage selection, and CB trouble circuit. And DC 2 supply is given to the indication circuit. So whenever the DC selector switch position is kept at switch position 1, so both this J15, that is this source, this DC will be selected from the DC source 1. Again, whenever the DC selector switch kept at independent position, that then J15, J16 will get DC source from the DC supply 1, and this will get from the DC source 2. That is, the this 2 DC will be independent of the DC selector switch. Whenever the DC selector switch position kept at DC source source 2, then this will get from the DC source 2, and this is also getting DC from the DC source 2. So this is all about DC selector switch and double DC source. So friends, if you like my video, then please like, hit the like button, and do subscribe my channel, and also press bell button for notification of videos to be uploaded in future. Thank you for watching this video.